We are all in the firm grip of the material world, for everywhere we look, our gaze is met by our own reflections. We seek out escape routes, hidden pathways through undisclosed territories, soaring flights of the imagination that aim momentarily to release us from our entombment within this world of illusion and pain. But these reflections, these images, these idola, these phantasmata pursue us wherever we may go, and this pursuit has never been as fierce as in the modern world. As contemporary futurist Michael Garfield has rightly observed, we live in the age of glass. If we care to distinguish epochs of human civilizational advancement from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, a moment's reflection will lead one to the indisputable realization that everything that undergirds modernity, beginning from the Galilean and scientific revolution, emerged and continually emerges through the material substrate of glass. Whether through a telescope or a microscope, or a mode of information dissemination through televisions, computers, or phone screens, we are continually surrounded by glassy, reflective surfaces. Architecturally speaking, our homes and apartments are also increasingly made of this reflective material. To quote directly from Garfield's essay entitled "The Future is Indistinguishable from Magic," he states, quote, "Glass is the water in which modern minds swim, the invisible environment, technology that started indistinguishable from an act of magic. Solve et coagula, the belching hellmouth of a cinder cone, the peeling veins of molten silica. Glass is the element of alchemy. First onyx black and jagged, and then red hot and pliable, and then cool, clear, and rigid, a refinement on which early scientists mapped the evolution of the soul. Glass is still a magic substance, matrix for subsequent delicate technologies we only notice when they break. It is the patron substance of the scientific method, test tubes, telescopes and microscopes, and prisms, slides, and screens. Glass gave us to a conceptual device with which to talk about the crystal spheres we wrapped our world in, a firmament to hold the stars in place. We broke that model when we wrapped a park in glass in 1851, the London Exhibition's Crystal Palace, what would one day be the World's Fair. Furthermore, almost all mirrors we encounter and take for granted today are composed of this substance, glass. In the ancient world, mirrors were typically made of silver or bronze, and according to Shadi Bartsch's work entitled The Mirror of the Self, the mirror, the eosoptron, always held a distinctly ambivalent position. It was typically associated with women who would prune themselves and admire their own features. Mirrors were deemed unbecoming a serious man, and something that lent an element of effeminacy and perhaps even decadence. Dionysius of Halicarnassus recounts the story of Aristodemus, the tyrant, who gave the young men of Cumae mirrors, combs, and perfumes, in order to make them effeminate. We can see echoes of this critique of the mirror in Ovid's story of the myth of Narcissus. Quote, "Unknowingly he desires himself, and the one who praises is himself praised, and while he courts is courted, so that equally he inflames and burns. How often he gave his lips in vain to the deceptive pool, how often, trying to embrace the neck he could see, he plunged his arms into the water but could not catch himself within them." But on the other hand, the mirror was seen as a tool for self-knowledge. The famous Delphic maxim gnothi sauton, which is first echoed in a fragment of Heraclitus alongside the word sophronein, linked the idea of knowing oneself to a sense of having prudence or proper proportionality and measure. It pertains to all men to know themselves and to be temperate, or also known as sound-minded. There is an ethical rationale for self-reflection. When you looked into the mirror, the ancient expectation was that this mirror accurately reflected you and the state of your soul. And since the assumption that the internal constitution was reflected outwardly, your face essentially showed the state of your soul. The mirror's role was then to distance you from yourself, so that you could view yourself from an objective third-person perspective. seeing yourself as others see you. And by noting certain things, you could make adjustments depending on what the mirror reflection revealed. Bartsch is clear that at this point in time, this self-reflection and introspection was not a descent into, quote, the hidden depths of the soul or a Freudian uncovering of the unconscious desires of the id. And it was also not the mind contemplating the mind in a moment of self-reversion. Again, prior to Socrates and Plato, sophrosune and self-knowledge had more to do with a comprehension and adherence to your duties, responsibilities, and role within society. Later, with Plato, the mirror in the dialogue Alcibiades 1 introduces an impersonal sort of reflection which allows one to see the divine in all of us, quote unquote. Self-knowledge in this instance becomes knowledge of the divine. Even Apuleius, in his defense against accusations of being a sorcerer, had to defend the presence of a mirror in his home by responding to his accusers, quote, "Is not Socrates the philosopher reported to have enjoined upon his students to contemplate themselves frequently in a mirror, that so those among them who were self-satisfied with their beauty might above all else take care that they did not disfigure the attractiveness of their body by bad character traits?" But there is distinctly more to the mirror than ethics and virtue on the one hand, and empty narcissism and vanity on the other. One of the enduring myths of antiquity is the tearing apart of Dionysus-Zagreus by the Titans. It is generally accepted among scholars that Philodemus, in his work entitled On Piety, is the most solid piece of evidence linking the dismemberment myth to the Orphics. Quote, "They say that Dionysus had 3 births. One of these is that from his mother, another that from the thigh of Zeus, and the third the one when he was torn apart by the Titans and came back to life after Rhea reassembled his limbs. And in his Mopsopia, Euphorion agrees with his account. The Orphics too dwell on it intensively." Let us briefly recount the story. Dionysus, or Zagreus, is the child of Zeus and Persephone. Zeus's intention is to have Dionysus serve as the final king, having been preceded by 5 prior rulers. Sparked by the jealous wrath of Hera, the Titans plot to murder him. They use toys and various objects to lure the infant Dionysus. The toys, called athurmata, or sometimes symbola, are a mirror, knuckle bones, an apple, a sphere, a bull roarer, a spinning top, and a fleece. The Titans paint their faces white and lure him away from the guardian Curetes. They kill Dionysus and dismember him into 7 pieces. They then proceed to boil his limbs and then to taste them. Zeus orders Apollo to collect his limbs. In other accounts, for example in Philodemus's, it is Rhea who collects his limbs. In some sources, oinos, or wine, is used to refer to Dionysus. The only part that is saved from destruction is Dionysus' heart, and this is done by Athena, and in some other traditions, Apollo or Hermes. Apollo then collects the scattered limbs and relocates them to Mount Parnassus in Delphi. Using Dionysus' preserved heart, Zeus returns him back to life. The goddess Hypta then receives the newborn Dionysus and puts him in a winnowing fan, which is encircled by a snake on her head. Zeus punishes the Titans by throwing a thunderbolt and burning them into ash or smoke or even blood. And it is from this sooty substance, the aithale, that the human race is born. This myth is situated right at the precise moment when the soul is becoming embodied into matter. Or another way of saying this is when the moment when the divine power is divided into matter. The discovery of an Orphic papyrus dated to the 3rd century BC in the town of Gurob in Egypt at the entrance to Fayum is believed to have been possessed by what is called an Orphiotelesta. These were itinerant priests who would wander from place to place, armed with a variety of religious practices and tools that they could use to purify the souls of those willing to pay for such services. The entire papyrus contains instructions for either an initiate and or a priest for the conducting of a ritual. presumably to purify the stains or to atone for the crimes of the Titans who dismembered Dionysus. The last lines of the ritual papyrus state a few of the Dionysian toys. Put into the basket, cone, bull roar, knuckle bones, mirror. As we can see, the mirror is the last object mentioned to be placed in the basket. Perhaps this suggests something about its importance or finality in the ritual. Mirrors, generally speaking, allow us to access the inaccessible. For instance, you can look around a corner by positioning the mirror at a particular angle. And magically, you can also somehow conjure or duplicate the world around you. Everywhere you position your mirror, the reflected object will miraculously appear as if duplicated. For example, using this one simple tool, you can even double the sun, as if there were two in the sky. This mirroring can also double the soul and serve as a tool to extract the image from the actual source of the image, that which produces it. In this very sense, the doubling power of a mirror operates much like intoxication does. A literary example of this phenomenon can be shown in Euripides' Bacchae, when the frenzied Pentheus experiences a literal ecstasis, as standing outside of oneself, and sees the disguised Dionysus turning into a bull. He says, quote, "Look, I seem to see two suns in the sky. The seven-gated city of Thebes, I see two of them. And you seem to be going before me as a bull, and horns seem to have sprouted upon your head. Were you an animal before now? Certainly now you have been changed into a bull." And the disguised Dionysus responds, quote, "The god has made a truce and is with us now, though before he was our enemy, and now you see as you ought to see." In this sense, Dionysus' epithet in the Orphic traditions as diffuus, two-formed, or having two natures, is very appropriate. So much ink has been spilt regarding scholarly interpretation of the different and often contradictory information contained in the variety of Orphic texts, from the Derveni Papyrus to the Orphic Rhapsodies and everything in between. But there is a strong argument that these texts interact not only with the scientific and theological inquiries of their day, but also that these texts simultaneously interact with one another in their mythic content. Therefore, some scholars like Bernabe, who take a maximalist approach to the reconstitution of the Orphic material, have sought to create a unified grand narrative underlying a coherent story. While other scholars, like Edwards, take inspiration more from the bricoleur interpretation, where the fragmented and fluid material was meant to work in a more spontaneous and autonomous fashion, serving the needs of the moment or inquiry, rather than being simply fragments of a grand narrative. Many Neoplatonists incorporated this myth to illustrate certain points that they wanted to make, and this reflects the intimations of the latter set of scholars we have just mentioned. There is a strong implication that there was no unified single Orphic, quote, story, but rather a series of interrelated Orphic moments, selected and combined and rearranged according to the needs of the moment. Plotinus, Proclus, Olympiodorus, and Damascius all focus on elements of the Zagreus myth, while highlighting certain fragments and minimizing or excluding others, in order to appropriately suit their immediate philosophical objectives. For instance, Olympiodorus' articulation of the myth, which culminates in the realization that the human is simultaneously Titanic and Olympian in nature due to their Titanic ancestors' murderous actions, is mentioned with the intent of supporting Socrates' argument against suicide, since that would be an affront to our Dionysiac and hence divine self. Quote, "And Zeus, being angry with them," that is the Titans, "struck them with his thunderbolts, and from the soot coming from the vapors that transpired from them was produced the matter out of which men are created. Therefore we must not kill ourselves, not because, as the text appears to say, we are in the body as a kind of bond, for that is obvious, and Socrates would not call this a mystery. But we must not kill ourselves because our bodies are Dionysiac. We are in fact a part of him, if indeed we come about from the sublimate of the Titans who ate his flesh." Similarly, Proclus identified Dionysus as the intellect, the cosmic soul, and the notion of a divisible yet indestructible unity. Proclus also preserves a unique piece of insight when he says in Orphic fragment 308, quote, "And while he, Dionysus, observed his elusive image being reflected in a mirror made by Hephaestus, they destroyed him with a horrible knife." According to Proclus, the mirror seems to have been created by Hephaestus, the god of technophany and craftsmanship. As Butler notes, when Hephaestus experiences a fall because of Hera's wrath, this descent, quote, "expresses the element of the incalculable, or even the unintelligible, which this stage in the procession of being demands for its fullness of expression. The god's experience of descent is not only the precondition for his work as a craftsman, who is intimately linked with the nature of matter, or hule, but is also simultaneously an experience of the mortal soul, who, quote, experiences itself thus as thrown or raptured into embodiment. In this sense, when Hephaestus is cast out of Olympus by Hera, he is confronting and encountering what Butler calls, quote, the incalculable and unpredictable, the mystery of materials that is inherent in technological experimentation. This matter serves as a smooth and polished reflective mirror, and is presented to the infant Dionysus, in which he contemplates his own image as the Titans gather round him. Butler makes reference to the lesser-known tradition, which reintegrates Hephaestus to Olympus through the mediation of Dionysus. Part of this tradition is preserved by the poet Alcaeus that associates the rare encounter between Hera and Dionysus. The poet composed a hymn recounting how Hephaestus had enchained Hera for having cast him from Olympus, and it was through the instrumental work of Dionysus, who intoxicated Hephaestus with wine, mounted him on a donkey, and brought him back in order to release her from the bonds he had confined her in. Fragment 333 of Alcaeus states, quote, oinos gar anthropo dioptron, which translates to wine is a mirror to humans. It should be noted that Dionysus is often referred to in other Orphic fragments by the name oinos, or wine. For instance, Orphic fragment 303 alludes to Hera's jealous wrath, quote, being indignant at Oinos, the son of Zeus. The way I interpret this fragment is that Dionysus, in the form of his intoxicating power and its material manifestation as wine, is providing a necessary distance from the mortal soul with regards to its identification with the mirrored and hence non-essential aspect, the part of ourselves that we mistakenly identify as ourselves when we become embodied. After all, in many instances, Alcaeus makes reference to Dionysus as having given wine to men so that they could forget their pains. Alcaeus, fragment 346, sings, drink, is it lamps we're waiting for? A finger of day is left, no more. Come on, my man, break out the great wine goblets, massy and ornate. With the grapes' gift, Semele's son and Zeus's gave oblivion from suffering to mortal men. 1 part to 2, mix water in. And after all, according to Elias Aristides, quote, nothing can be so firmly bound, neither by illness nor by wrath or fortune, that cannot be released by Dionysus. Perhaps Hephaestus had gifted Dionysus the mirror of matter and the smooth reflectiveness of the material world in repayment for the god's assistance in the eventual reintegration into the Olympian realm. Wine seemingly having the quality to loosen our attachment to false identities, heal our sufferings and pains, if only momentarily, and aid us in the return movement toward our source, which is also a form of healing. Most scholarly analysis of the Dionysian mirror equates it with this symbolism of matter, as if the mirror is somehow external from Dionysus himself. If Dionysus is the soul, then the mirror, when contemplated, must therefore represent the material world in which he ends up finding himself trapped with the divisive forces of the Titans. In this view, the image of the soul projected into the mirror of matter is the psychophysiological aspect of the individual. But I'd like to highlight an excellent article by Vassilopoulou, which argues that Plotinus viewed the mirror's role quite differently. In her article, Human Self in the Myth of Dionysus and Plotinus, she argues, in contrast to this analysis, that rather, quote, the myth of Dionysus is not the story of an encounter between the soul and something external to it, but rather the story of the transformation of the soul itself within the process of its embodiment. In this way, the mirror becomes a symbola for the mortal soul's capacity to retain self-identity while having just projected itself in reflective images that happen to distort it. According to Vassilopoulou, Plotinus' approach to the dismemberment myth of Dionysus-Zagreus was more philosophically motivated. There is a feeling that Plotinus ignores the more mythical and gruesome details of the episode. Quote, "But the souls of men, seeing the images of themselves like Dionysus in a mirror having been set in motion from above, they come to be there without being cut off. Not even these, from the principle of themselves and from Nous. For although they did not come with the Nous, they nevertheless reached as far as earth. Yet their head was firmly set beyond the heaven. It happened to them to come down more, inasmuch as their middle rank was obliged to take care of that which they reached which needed care. Father Zeus, having pitied them for being in pain, makes their bonds mortal. The bonds, in respect of which they are in pain, in times giving them interval or pauses, making them free of bodies, in order that they too might come to be there, where the soul of the all always is, without turning towards any of the things here." Vassilopoulou asserts that what Plotinus intends to do through his own interpretation is to, quote, respect the experience of the soul itself. And we learn later what this in fact means. Plotinus is not interested in a theoretical perspective removed or abstracted from the experience of the soul in its moment of embodiment, because ultimately that would create a static allegory. Instead, Plotinus aims for something more dynamic, which in the words of Vassilopoulou, serve as, quote, a figurative device, facilitating the transition of the spectator from a sensible to an intelligible perspective. On a metaphysical level, what Plotinus is emphasizing for us is that the principle of fragmentation is already contained within the nature of the soul, and that there is no externalization of the principle of fragmentation in the form of the Titans or the mirror. After all, the souls of men came down after seeing images of themselves. This removes any sense of titanic division and tearing apart, and hence the notion of ancestral crime and consequent guilt. In fact, elsewhere in the Enneads, Plotinus attributes the descent into materiality to the soul's ignorance or childish foolishness, which is inherent to the nature of the soul itself. So this means that equating matter with the mirror, as many scholars have tried to do, will simply not work. And as Plotinus notes elsewhere, the boundary between the sensible realm and the intelligible realm is not found through the mirror, but found within the soul itself. All images are generated through both mirrors and matter, since images receive their existence from something that is other than them. Similarly, matter receives all impressions and forms, but ultimately lacks all being, and hence, like Plato's Chora, matter is pure passivity. It endlessly receives, but holds or contains nothing. In essence, the mirror provides the thinnest of barriers or partitions that separate or create a distance between the intelligible and sensible realms, and this boundary is so slender that the two realms nearly touch. In the proximity and touching of the intelligible with the sensible realms, we can see how Plotinus is interested in reducing the perceived distance between matter and form through the mediation of this material, that is, the mirror. In essence, the intelligible realm is not some far-flung distant world, but is intimately linked with the world of the senses we inhabit. This erotic encounter between the two realms can be detected by activities of the soul, who manages to seduce itself with the mirror, pursuing its image, and by doing so, the mortal soul, i.e. Dionysus, is carried away from the, quote, palace of the intelligible world to the, quote, woods of the sensible world, also known as hule, which translates as both woods and matter itself. But as Vassilopoulou later observes, quote, the mirror is not just a toy that induces Dionysus to move from his father's palace to the woods. Rather, it contains the woods, or makes it possible for the woods to exist, and the woods are precisely the reflective space in which the soul is to extend, to move without actually going anywhere. To this last point, ultimately, the soul is not, quote, moving anywhere, but is rather extending itself or stretching forth. To be clear, the entirety of the soul never comes into direct contact with matter itself. There is no dualism in Plotinus' thought. As Vassilopoulou notes, the embodied soul lives in a dynamic state in which its self-identity is always at risk as the soul, in pursuing what it takes to be itself, becomes other than itself. And it is precisely this condition that provides the starting point of philosophical reflection. Furthermore, as the soul is embodied, an after effect is that it is forced to care for something that presents itself as external or other, and hence, Zeus in his mercy provides a means by which the soul can still participate in a transcendent nous, well away from the necessity to continually care for and pursue other things in this world of dependence and interdependence. Here lies the core of the disagreement between Plotinus and Iamblichus regarding the status of the undescended or fully descended soul. A palimpsest was discovered in the library of St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai and recently translated a few years ago. Although this recent fragment mentions the Titans, we can see Dionysus struggling with the contemplative and noetic aspects provided by Zeus. Quote, Dionysus was about to stand up from the throne, but he pondered his father's counsels, which all-wise Zeus first gave him when he led him from the stream of ocean into heaven. With regard to the, quote, movement of the soul into Hule, there is metaphysically no real movement at all. Plotinus says, quote, if body did not exist, soul would not go forth, since there is no place other than body where it is natural for it to be. If it is to go forth, it will generate a place for itself, and so a body. The implications of this statement are both profound and radical. What Plotinus is essentially saying is that our assumption that the soul descends or moves into a pre-existing material vessel to animate it is misguided. It is in fact the body that enters, quote, into the space provided for it by the soul's extension. Quoting Plotinus, the universe extends as far as soul goes. Its limit of extension is the point to which in going forth it has soul to keep it in being. What all this means is that space is pre-existent within the soul itself. By projecting itself through its reflections, the soul is internally multiplying a series of idola or images. For the soul to continue into generation, it must by definition extend itself, and in order to do so, it needs a space for it to extend into. As each series of soul images are projected, and a body is being created for each level, we experience a diminution of the light, to the point where Vassilopoulou notes, quote, every psychic image is necessarily embodied, and can be thus described as, quote, the shadow of the soul, the image of the illumination, or the image of life present in living bodies. In order to prevent an infinite division of the soul into matter, and for it to get lost there indefinitely, there must be a way for the soul to revert through anagoge back to its source. And for Vassilopoulou, the Dionysian mirror is precisely the symbol that allows for the soul to, quote, bounce back, by which she means the ability of the soul to retain its identity and not get entirely fragmented into a series of images of itself that are other than its true self. The mirror of Dionysus, therefore, serves the soul in recollecting its original state of unity. This mirror is not one of matter, so it is not matter that provides a barrier against further projection and division, but the soul's mirror which reflects its original unity. And rather than trying to escape or evade its image formation, it provides philosophical reflection, which allows for the soul to identify its own extended self in every one of the series of images it generated. This is performed through the unitive force of the intellect. As we discussed in our previous video on apathy or illusion in the works of Peter Kingsley, it is only by confronting the images and deceptions head-on and recognizing their true origin in ourselves that we can begin to reverse the process of our own dispersion. The question of why Dionysus looks into the mirror in the first place was mentioned earlier as ignorance or childishness. But there is also a sense in which the soul is a, quote, restlessly active nature, which wanted to control itself and be on its own, and chose to seek for more than its present state. And, quote, it comes out of the intelligible world and cannot endure unity, but embraces its own individuality and wants to be different, and so to speak, put its head outside, in order to gaze at itself in the mirror of Dionysus. There are two moments in the process of embodiment. The first is projection, whereby the soul's gaze into the mirror results in an image that reverts back towards it. The first moment can be understood as an act of externalization or objectification. The second moment is an act of reflection, which occurs when the soul looks at the image a second time, but this time engages with it creatively, or more actively and intimately. This creative activity of the soul is what Vassilopoulou identifies as the shaping, ordering, and managing of the sensible world, which can be considered under the domain of the soul. What we can finally say here is that for Plotinus, the creative act is essentially wedded to the soul's joy at self-recognition. The soul is not simply recreating the intelligible realm in the realm of the sensible, but is contemplating itself. And through this self-contemplation is recognizing itself and attaining self-knowledge. Quite literally, by embodying itself, the soul is also simultaneously forming a visible body, which includes all the senses, and for Plotinus's intents and purposes, primarily vision, which allows for the possibility for such self-recognition to occur in the first place, and the joy that arises from it. Between being and non-being, it is in its own world, but if it looks again with a sort of second gaze, it shapes the image and enters into it well pleased. Hesthesa can be translated as either well pleased or rejoicing. Here we can see Plotinus's implicit view that creation and contemplation of the image are linked to the possibility for self-recognition. Although there is a great danger in the soul misidentifying itself as the image, it is also necessary for the soul to recognize that each of the images that it generates are precisely reflections from the self. Here for Plotinus lies the tension of the soul between its pull toward the sensible and the calling towards its origins in the intelligible. One last thing I want to mention that emerges from this consideration of the joy of recognizing that emerges from contemplating its creation is this idea of a fall or original sin of the human, which is wholly absent from the text. The Christians would appropriate Plotinus's philosophy, seeing in him a pagan who could easily be seen to support a Christian message of a fall from divine grace into darkness of materiality and evil. But as we can see from this video, if Plotinus had wanted to show a descent of the soul as a result of a violent crime or collective sin, then he would have leaned into the notion of the Titan's dismemberment of Dionysus. It is also clear that his works are an engagement and critical response to the Gnostics, a broad category that for him were synonymous with the Christians. I have also noticed some of the parallels with the Hermetic work entitled Poimandres, in which we encounter a similar story with a similar motivation. Nous gives birth to what is called the human, and at the same time the demiurgic Nous is the brother of human. And human would like to create just like his demiurgic brother does. So he travels around the cosmos, and by bending down, he pierces the circumference of the spheres and looks at nature, seen here as a personified feminine other. Nature sees this powerful luminous being reflected in her waters, and on his side, quote, he looks at her and perceives a shape like his own down there. Together they fall in love, and then they make love of one another, and out of their union create 7 androgynous humans. At no point is there mention of evil or woe. Hanegraaf, in his excellent book entitled Hermetic Spirituality, notes how the product of the union results in what is called a thaumasiotaton, a most wondrous wonder or most miraculous miracle. This is no regrettable decline, and he identifies that many early 20th century scholars like Festugière and Reitzenstein were influenced by Christian and Gnostic assumptions of materiality, embodiment, and human creativity as essentially bad or evil. What Hanegraaf notes is that embodiment is a divine gift, but which comes at a price. We can only experience pleasures and joys in an embodied form, but the cost of that embodiment is to be under the jurisdiction of the planetary spheres in Hymarmene. So whether we think philosophically like Plotinus or theurgically like Iamblichus, it becomes clear that the path to the one is synonymous with the rejoicing of the soul and the rejoicing of the gods. And this rejoicing is through a creative engagement with the material world and its images. However, the key to reversion is to see this all reflected in the mirror of Dionysus. If only as if in a glass darkly. Take care for now.